For a man of Amos's temperament, this meant creating a regular routine, which had to be stuck to no matter what. A shattering hangover, for instance. It had to be flexible too, though, to accommodate the fringe activities of a popular writer, such as visiting a broadcasting studio, and to allow time for social activities, especially drinks or lunch with friends, which to Amos was vitally necessary as both recreation and reward. Mornings became the key to the Amos work routine. On a typical day, with no outside engagements, he would start slowly with breakfast and the newspapers, telling himself that it was his duty as a writer to keep up with events in the world, while knowing perfectly well that what he was really doing was providing himself with an excuse for postponing the awful moment when he must sit down at the typewriter and start getting words on paper. Around 10:30, still unshaven and in a dressing gown, he would force himself to his desk, where he would stay till 1 p.m. or soon after. Then he would shower, shave, and have a drink. After an hour or so's more work, came lunch. The afternoon was always something of a black hole. Unless there was a piece to be finished against an inexorable deadline, Amos would avoid writing until it was time for a cup of tea. He might read or take the dog for a walk for an hour or two until then. But whatever he did, it was not meant to count. In the contract he had drawn up between himself and himself, the hours from lunch to tea were not expected to be productive. Anything they did produce was a bonus on top of the regular daily output. After tea it was back to the typewriter, where he stayed until 8:30, drinking more tea until he switched to alcohol at 6. Over the years Amos's routine has varied in detail, but always around this basic pattern: an intensive morning, followed by a fairly vacant afternoon, and a final burst of energy in the evening before dinner. Routine provided Amos with the necessary framework for his life. If he had not been a writer, he would surely have had to find some other frame within which to cage and discipline himself. At times he has wondered if he would not have been happier as a journalist. He would still have written, but in a less lonely, more sociable atmosphere, in an office full of chums and with a pub around the corner. But it must be doubtful if he could have lived easily with the irregular rhythms of Fleet Street, typically made up of long bouts of idleness and uncertainty, followed by sudden panic rushes to deadline. On one of these few occasions, when he was subject to Fleet Street rules, he was instructed to rewrite a column for the Sunday Express within an hour or so, and he hated having to do as he was told in so short and unyielding a period of time. While Amos was following his writing routine in his study, Jane was following hers in another room, and when both were finished, they would settle down and read aloud to each other what they had written during the day. As novelists they might have been jealous or competitive, but they were not. Rivalry did not arise. In no other aspect of their lives did each understand and sympathize with the other's problems better. A partner who was not a writer of fiction would probably shrug off, in irritable style, worries about plot or character, about whether the personality of Amos's Mr. X really was convincing, or if too many words were not being wasted, moving this or that bit of Jane's story along. But Amos and Jane knew that these were exactly the sort of seemingly trivial things that made writers anxious. They encouraged each other and offered suggestions, each becoming so much in tune with the other's writing that on one occasion they were both able to write a few pages of the other's novel in progress. Amos wrote a bit of Jane's After Julius, and she wrote a bit of his One Fat Englishman, and they did it so plausibly that it was impossible for anyone else to tell who wrote what. Monkey was the exception, who spotted the differences. Their cooperation as writers was to be the most durable part of their relationship, lasting to the very end, when every other part was dissolving. 16. Maida, Vale. During his first year with Jane, Amos worked on a novel, The Egyptologists, and a critical work, The James Bond Dossier, both of which were published in 1965. Here was evidence of his burgeoning professionalism and readiness to turn his hand to writing beyond his mainstream novels and poetry. They gave him a chance to earn some much-needed money, too, and to put behind him the more rigid austerities of university life. Amos had no colleagues now to call him a pornographer at the first hint of sexual impropriety. He could have some fun without worrying what effect it would have on his chances of promotion, or his reputation as an academic of the required weight and substance. The Egyptologists had been lurking around waiting to be completed since 1960. It lurked in the form of a rough draft by Robert Conquest, who had devised the idea for the story and given it a working title, Mummy Knows Best. Conquest's plan was for Amos to knock his version into good enough shape for it to be published under both their names. The basic idea revolved around a club supposedly dedicated to the study of ancient Egypt, but in fact a cover for its members to get away from their wives and pursue other women. As Amis remembers it, he invented new scenes and characters and generally put in the plot. He took it with him in August 1964, when he and Jane went for a holiday in the house he had rented in Majorca, which had been empty since Hilly returned to England with the children before Christmas. Amis reported progress to Conquest from there. Life proceeds in a full-of-fun way. With Cointreau at the equivalent of something like 30 shillings a magnum, it can hardly do anything else. I'm quite brown, really. Graves seems a bit dejected, but very ready to chat. Various creepy, non-exhibiting painters, non-publishing writers, etc., inhabit his ambience, but who cares a sod for them? Egyptology, given sun, wine, and other distractions, doesn't go forward very fast, but it is steady. I've just passed page 100, which I reckon is halfway. I think we stand to make a modest packet out of the bloody thing. The Egyptologists was finished at the beginning of December. I ought to have told you earlier, Amis wrote to Conquest at the end of that month, but general fucking about, including Xmas and disinclination having finished typing out these, to do anything whatever, this imposed a delay. The final scenes follow you on the whole. Anyway, I think you'll approve. Amis's forecast of making a modest packet out of it came true. Richard, later Lord Attenborough, bought the film rights for £25,000, which Amis and Conquest divided between them, though Attenborough never got around to making the film. A second Conquest draft novel was not so fruitful. Peach Key, which sounds as if it must be a Caribbean island, but when spoken aloud also sounds like the word for cunt in Bulgarian, a language Conquest knew, had been lurking alongside the Egyptologists since 1960, waiting its turn for Amis to get to grips with it. Over the next 3 decades it continued to lurk until in October 1993 Amis got the typescript out once more. He had sent off his latest novel to his publisher the day before, and wondered if now might not be the moment to get down to Conquest's project at last. But after looking through Peach Key again, he abandoned it once and for all. Like the Egyptologists, it, too, was about escaping from women, but Amis decided there was not enough raw material in it for him to work on. The setting, for example, was the Caribbean, but there seemed no evidence in the text that Conquest had actually been there or knew anything much about it, so Amis put it away for the very last time and launched himself into another novel instead. Before he got down to serious work on the Egyptologists, in fact, by May 1964, Amis had already finished the James Bond dossier. It took him 5 months. He had started out by carrying off on holiday all Ian Fleming's 12 Bond novels, and 1 volume of Bond short stories, thinking he might be able to get an essay, or perhaps 5,000 words out of them. But he found as he worked that there was more in them than he had realized, and he finished up with a book of some 160 pages. The book has a serious purpose, but in the context of its production it can also look like a cheeky 2-fingered salute to the academic world, a farewell raspberry blown at all things pedantically donnish, in a manner Lucky Jim would surely have approved. For to Ian Fleming's oeuvre, Amis brought the anatomizing and categorizing zeal he never had devoted, and never would devote, to more elevated works of literature. With almost parodic scholarly dedication, he analyzed the activities of Secret Agent 007 in the most minute detail. How many men did Bond kill? Answer 38.5, by his own hand, with another 70 killed by other people and 500 more blown up in one go at Fort Knox. How many girls did Bond go to bed with? Answer, 1 per foreign trip, though on a single occasion 2, making him not much randier than the average travelling businessman or holiday-maker. What characteristics did Bond girls have in common? Answer, the majority were blondes, and all but 2 had blue eyes. What did Bond villains have in common? Answer, not much, except they were apt to be big, and all had at least a glint of red in their villainous eyes. Dissecting Bond's boss M, otherwise Admiral Sir Miles Messervy, KCMG, Amis found him to be a peevish, priggish old monster, a description deduced in part from account of the adjectives used to describe him. Impatient, for example, showed up no fewer than 7 times. Nor could Amis resist a mild flourish of scholarly triumph at turning up for himself a few errors of fact in Fleming's work. which had a reputation for being particularly acute in its most sophisticated and worldly details. Most of Bond's early enemies were employed by an organization called SMERSH. However, observed Amis, the Soviet body of that name had been redesignated OKR for Odli Kontrasvedki in 1946, several years before the first Bond adventure, and he continued in learned vein, both SMERSH and OKR were simply two of the various labels successively attached to what had originally, 1921, been founded as special sections, Ozbai Odli, of the main USSR internal affairs apparatus, the Cheka, later the GPU, later the OGPU, later the NKVD, later the MVD. Rather than SMERSH, Bond's enemies should have been in the service of the INU, the Second Chief Directorate, Foreign Intelligence of the MGB, in particular the INU's 9th Section of Terror and Diversion, Devyati Otul Potaruru I Devasi. The hand of Robert Conquest, Soviet scholar as well as drafter of novels for Amis to complete, in addition to pamphlets in the London Library, can be seen behind such recondite expertise. When it came to drink, though, Amis had his own expertise to draw on, with a little help from the wine writer Cyril Ray. This enabled him to report that when Goldfinger gave Bond a Peace Porter Goldtropfen 53, he was giving Bond a Moselle, not a Hock, as Goldfinger himself wrongly believed. Amis was even able to find a flaw in Bond's famous dry martinis. According to the Bond recipe, these should be made with 3 measures of Gordon's gin and 1 of vodka, brand unspecified, plus a half measure of Quina Lillet. But Amis noted Quina Lillet was in fact the name of a wine aperitif flavoured, I'm assured, with quinine. What Bond should have used in his martinis was a dry vermouth, called simply Lillet, made admittedly by the same firm, Lillet Frères, but an altogether different concoction. Amis even went so far as to provide a reference guide to the novels and short stories, breaking each down into 10 component parts, which he presented in columns across 2 pages at the end of the book, each column with headings like Places, Girl, Villains, Project. In the last column, headed Remarks, Amis gave each a rating. Horrific and haunting in a way none of the others are, but travel book material intrudes, was his verdict on You Only Live Twice. If there seems something tongue-in-cheek about this performance, a turning of heavyweight critical guns on material Amis himself acknowledged could be called harmless tomfoolery, he had serious points to make too. He liked the Bond books, as he had always liked other forms of popular art, and he was happy to pay them scholarly tribute. Already, in New Maps of Hell, 1960, he had written a pioneering study of science fiction. Here was another type of fiction, unlikely to be much bothered with in the Academy. But why not? Amis's investigation of Bond had proved 2 things to him: that the novels were just as complex and had just as much in them as more ambitious kinds of fiction, and that they had been quite unjustly attacked for snobbery, sadism, anti-feminism, indeed for being a systematic onslaught on everything decent and sensible in modern life. Amis turned most of these charges against the people who made them. Weren't they the real snobs? If only Ian Fleming had injected a bit of portentousness into his fiction, thrown in a few Freudian dreams, and sprinkled around some knowing references to, say, Kokoschka, Schoenberg, Reg Butler, and Norman Douglas, what a difference it would have made to the reviewers. That huge virtue of never stooping to any kind of pretentiousness, of never going in for any kind of arty or symbolical flannel, has cost Mr. Fleming a formidable amount of critical acclaim, Amis wrote. But it's done as much as anything to bring him readers. The importance of attracting readers, of communicating with an audience, was something that had preoccupied Amis since the days of his Oxford thesis, and continued to do so. The 9 Bond books, which had by this time been published in paperback, had each sold more than 1 million copies, and all these books had been bought for only one reason: pleasure. As a recently retired university teacher, Amis wrote in his preface, I can't help being drawn to any form of writing which, like science fiction, reaches no part of its audience through compulsion. 1 volunteer is worth 12 pressed men. Amis met Ian Fleming twice. The first time, at a spectator party, he told Fleming he greatly admired his work. Fleming thanked him and said, They're all true, you know. What? Yes. If you go to the Nevsky Prospect in Moscow and you go to the 7th floor, you will find the offices of SMERSH, with Colonel General Grobozobojchikov sitting there. Perhaps Fleming was pulling Amos's leg. At any rate, Amos did not take him seriously. The second time they met was after Amos had written the dossier. He sent Fleming a typescript, and Fleming asked him to lunch at L'Etoile restaurant in Charlotte Street. Amos went with some misgivings. Although his book was more pro than anti, Amos had pulled Fleming up where he thought Fleming had gone wrong, complaining, for instance, when the Bond books slipped into the idiom of the novelette. But Fleming wasn't worried about any of that. He had only two complaints to make. Oddjob had been sucked, not blown, out of the pressure cabin of an aircraft, and there was no St. Andrew's Golf Club. The club in question was the Royal and Ancient Golf Club. Apart from these, Fleming had no objections or corrections, and no quarrel with Amos's critical judgments. The Egyptologists and James Bond dossier not only provided Amos with some money and some intellectual light relief, they also marked an important stage in the decline of his relationship with Victor Gollancz, the publisher who had brought out Amos's books since Lucky Jim 10 years before. Early in May 1964, Amos wrote to Gollancz, telling him that he was on the point of completing the dossier. He hadn't mentioned it to him before, because he didn't think it was at all your sort of book. I'm pretty sure in my own mind that you have very little time for Fleming and the Fleming cult. Gollantz's heart would not be in it, and that was essential if the book was going to sell more than 4,000 or 5,000 copies, and Amos felt he could not afford to do less well than that. The hearts of Jonathan Cape, on the other hand, would be very much in it. Since they were Fleming's publisher, they already had an immense machine for distributing and publicizing Bond. After some not altogether comfortable pondering, Amos had decided that Cape should publish his own contribution to the Bond cult. But he went out of his way to insist that he still thought of Gollancz as my publisher, that all his future novels and other books would be Gollantz's to publish, and that he had no intention of going over to Cape. Scarcely 6 months later, though, Amos found himself writing another apologetic letter, this time over the Egyptologists. "You were so nice about the Bond book business that I don't like trespassing further on your good nature," he told Victor Gollancz. But Conquest had already been in touch with Cape, and they had agreed to publish the new book. Amos made light of the whole thing, saying that he'd only given the book a quick whiz-through, generally livening it up, and describing it as a pleasant vacation job. He was writing from Majorca. Admittedly, it had meant putting off getting down to his next proper novel, which was to be the Anti-Death League, but, said Amos, this delay would do it good rather than otherwise. The same had happened with Take a Girl Like You, and the prolonging of the gestation period benefited the result substantially. When he got home, Amos promised he would settle down to writing, and should be able to let Gollancz have his new novel by the following May. Victor Gollancz responded to this with the best grace he could muster. He said Amos was entirely within his rights in having the Egyptologists published by Cape, since he had only collaborated in it, and Cape had already accepted it from Conquest. For what it was worth, Gollancz gave the transaction his blessing, but he went on, "I cannot help feeling rather uneasy. The fact that Amos had brought out 2 books with Cape before anything new with Gollancz was bound to cause widespread comment. A lot of people are not merely going to ask, is Kingsley Amos leaving Gollancz for Cape, but are going to state it as a positive fact. None of this would matter much in minor cases," Gollancz continued, "but everyone knows that I think of you as much the most important, and I don't mean from the sales point of view, of my new post-war authors." Amos replied that he was prepared to go a long way towards actual violence if someone suggests that you and I are parting company. More soberly, he was willing to drop a word in the ear of a friendly journalist on a publishing trade newspaper if Victor thought a public denial of his defection would be worthwhile. There was a strong whiff of double talk in all this on both sides of the argument. The truth was that Victor did not much like Amos's work for its own sake, but was smart enough to know when a good thing had come his way. To keep Amos happy, rather than fervent enthusiasm, was the reason he had published Amos's 1956 volume of poetry, A Case of Samples, and his science fiction survey, New Maps of Hell. The latter, however, had done the company a favor. It made Hilary Rubinstein realize that there was potential for science fiction which had not been exploited in Britain, and encouraged the company to start a regular and highly profitable science fiction list of its own. Amos, for his part, was growing increasingly unhappy with the effort Gollancz was putting behind his work. Jane was published by Cape, and a shift there was very much on the cards, as Gollancz may well have suspected. The one thing that kept Amos with Victor was his liking for the man. Over the 10 years since the publication of Lucky Jim, the relationship between the two had its ups and downs. When Gallant's postponed publication of Amos's third novel, I Like It Here, without letting him know, Amos had exploded in synthetic fury. "You are a perfect louse to have put off publication till the 13th of January, he wrote in December 1957. "Oh, curse you! A lesser man than I would have been on the blower to Collins within the hour. You are the most annoying old sod, and I shall see that Graham Watson, Amos's agent, bleeds you white over the next book." But Amos signed the letter off on a characteristic note of ambiguous exasperation. "With renewed maledictions, threats, abuse, groans, and affection, yours ever, Kingsley." He had reason to be grateful as well as annoyed, for the company had been consistently helpful with advances against Amos's earnings, and in March 1962 Amos wrote to Victor to thank him for the last example of this. "Forgive me for not telling you long ago how sincerely grateful I am for your practical friendship. You don't know how much you have done for us. If anything was needed to secure my allegiance to you and to VG Limited, then this was it. But, as I hope you know, nothing was needed." Amos's allegiance was not as secure as that sounded. He liked Victor, but recognized his flaws, of which his gigantic egotism was the most prominent. This egotism was as apt to show up in his political campaigns as it was in his publishing office. He liked to be in charge wherever he was. By the early 1960s, his days as a crusader were largely over, though he was still chairman of the campaign against capital punishment. On this issue, at least, Amos could support him. He would by now have been unlikely to support him on Gallant's old left-wing crusades, and joined him on the platform of a great Albert Hall rally in April 1961, alongside John Freeman, the New Statesman editor and future ambassador to Washington, and Lord Gardiner, the future Lord Chancellor. Victor seized his chance to close the meeting with a rallying call for his own sub-campaign to stop Adolf Eichmann being hanged in Israel. Victor's egotism had its good side. It made him capable of the big gesture, which could mean more than cash advances. By the time Amos was ready to publish his sixth novel, The Anti-Death League, he had got fed up with the economical fashion in which Victor had so far produced his books. He wanted more than what he thought of as war economy-style typesetting, and he thought he was going to get it at last, as well as the artist of his choice for the cover. But when the proofs came in, he found the pages had been set up in the same old penny-pinching way. Amos protested to Victor, who immediately ordered the book to be set up in print again from scratch, and he let Amos have the jacket illustrator he wanted too. These were expensive gestures, but Victor had realized that no half-hearted titivating of the book's appearance would do. It had to be all or nothing. This was the kind of bold stroke Amos admired him for. On the other hand, Victor could be petty and mean. It rankled mildly with Amos that he never gave a traditional publisher's party for any Amos book launch. His egotism also made Victor a jealous man, and a poor delegator. He might have been expected to be pleased with his nephew Hilary Rubinstein for finding Amos in the first place, but he saw that sort of initiative as a challenge to his preeminence in his own company, and took over dealings with his most prestigious authors from Rubinstein or anyone else who brought them in. He seemed to lose no chance of putting Rubinstein in his place. On one occasion, lunching with an author, Victor declined to let Rubinstein choose his own food, and pointedly failed to offer him a cigar at the end of the meal, while he and the author both lit up. In 1963, Rubinstein finally left the company and joined the Observer as a journalist. Soon afterwards, Victor said innocently to Amos, "You know Hilary's joined the Observer. Don't know what good he thinks he'll do himself there." "You shit," thought Amos, "because you were the one who engineered Hilary's departure." This Victor had done by bringing in another man, James McGibbon, while Rubinstein was in New York, leaving Rubinstein's position in the company ill-defined, uncomfortable, and ultimately intolerable. The fact that Victor was bad at delegating made the firm of Gallant's too much of a one-man company, and less good at its job of selling books than it should have been, or so Amos believed. So long as Victor was there to run it, Amos would stay with him. But what if Victor, who was getting on in years, were to be sidelined through ill health or age? He might still be chairman, according to the company's notepaper, but he might not actually be running the shop. Victor was aware of Amos's feelings about this, and one day summoned his daughter Livia to his office while Amos was there. She was instructed to change the option clause in Amos's contract, which promised the company first chance to publish whatever his next book might be. The clause was to be effective only as long as Victor was in active control. This suited Victor's sense of his own importance as much as it did Amos's wish to be able to cut and run if for any reason Victor ceased to be in effective charge of his company. When Victor died, Amos wasted no time in ending his connection with the Gallants publishing house. On the 24th of February 1967 he wrote to Livia cancelling an impending lunch date. "This is a painful letter to write," he said, "and I've been putting it off in a cowardly fashion. I'd better just state the case bluntly. For some years I have been unhappy with Gallants Limited, and would long ago have moved elsewhere but for my personal loyalty to Victor. Victor himself understood this perfectly well and made no demur whatever about the get-out provision in the option clause of my last contract. Now, sadly, my loyalty is at an end, and I am off." The Anti-Death League was the last of his novels to be published by Gallants in 1966. For the next dozen years, Cape was to be Amos's principal publisher. Hilly and the children had moved on from Ovington Gardens soon after Christmas 1963. The flat there had only 2 bedrooms, between 4 people. She and Sally slept in one, the 2 boys in the other. But something larger was needed for children now advancing towards and through their teens, and a house was found in the Fulham Road, at a rent of £12 a week. It was shabby and not very well furnished, but when Hilly went away for a while with Sally, Jane and Amos moved in, and over the next couple of weeks Jane saw to it that the house was cleaned up and a bit of carpet put down. Later Hilly took in boarders and got herself a job at the Battersea Park Zoo, which she liked very much, animals being her chief enthusiasm and joy throughout her life. The family did not stay long in Fulham, only one Christmas. Then Hilly bought a house in Wivenhoe in Essex and moved there. Sally went off to boarding school while the boys joined Jane and their father in Maida Vale, visiting their mother at weekends and holidays. At Wivenhoe, the courtship began between Hilly and the man who was to become her second husband, David Roy Shackleton Bailey, then fellow and bursar at Gonville and Caius College, Cambridge, a classical scholar, and for 20 years the university lecturer in Tibetan, too. With a house, a car, and a suitor, Hilly began to get over the break-up with Amos, and to enjoy life again. All this moving about was disruptive, particularly of the children's education. Martin's was not helped by his taking 2 months off school in order to go to Jamaica, Hilly and Sally going with him. He had been given a part in the film of High Wind in Jamaica, but this piece of glory cut no ice with his school, Sir Walter St. John's in Battersea, which expelled him for his prolonged absence without leave. Martin came to think of this as something of an achievement, Sir Walter St. John's being a fairly rough place, at which it was hard to commit offences more worth being expelled for than anybody else's. Jane took an interest in the boys' education, rather more so than their father. It was she who encouraged them to take their schooling seriously and to cram for exams. Amos himself took a back seat in such matters. Perhaps Jane, having had little school education and none at all at university, valued it more than Amos, who, having had so good an education, took it for granted. As a father he was soft, generous, good fun, sweet, but not really a hands-on sort of parent, inclined to disappear into his study to avoid trouble. This did not stop there being some blazing rows. Amos, though tolerant enough about the girls the boys started to bring home, was much less easygoing about things like marijuana, then becoming fashionable among the rebellious 1960s young. In his hardening, right-wing view, drugs were among the things that communists used to undermine American soldiers in Vietnam, were thus part of the worldwide communist conspiracy, and so to be opposed on political grounds, never mind what harm they might do to health. Martin managed to live with this kind of argument, but Philip was more rebellious, and became the first of the 2 boys to leave home and set up on his own while still in his teens. To Jane, though, things looked rather different. There seemed to be something of an all-male alliance against her. She wanted the boys to be disciplined, to study and do well at school, while the men in the household seemed to her united in their indifference, if not their hostility to her good intentions. Jane did nevertheless succeed in putting Martin on the right educational road. He went for a year to a crammer in Brighton, Sussex tutors, and in that year did enough solid work to score a hat-trick of exam successes, 5 O-levels, 3 A's, and his Oxford entrance, which included getting his Latin up to O-level standard from scratch. With Latin his father played a larger role, claiming to have got Martin through that at least. When the results of his Oxford entrance exams were announced, Martin telephoned his father, who was then in Nashville, Tennessee. Amos heard Martin say that he had got into Exeter. "You mean Exeter University?" Amos queried. "No, Martin assured him, "Exeter College, Oxford." A much greater coup. But if it had not been for Jane's encouragement, Martin might not have made it to either university, and he was to remain always grateful for her having persuaded him to give schoolwork a serious try. Amos retained his detestation of hanging and racism, which he was to find in peculiarly virulent form in Nashville in the late 1960s, attitudes more common on the political left than the right. In most other respects, however, he continued his move to the right, though by drift rather than jump. There was no moment of conversion, no dramatic recantation. His thinking evolved in fits and starts until at some point in the 1960s, impossible to say exactly when, the Amos who in 1940 would have had trouble seeing enemies to his left now found trouble seeing them to his right. An Observer piece in July 1963 catches him in transition. Writing about patriotism, he said that its emphasis on hierarchy, order, responsibility, and so on, could help to prop me up. And then he added in a bracket, as though coyly admitting a small whisper of reproach from his conscience, or some imaginary left-wing friends, "You're moving right anyhow, Amos." But he was still left enough to end the piece by quoting George Orwell on England being a family with the wrong members in control, and concluding for himself that doing something about that would be another useful preliminary to restoring a sense of proper patriotism. Wariness about the upper class and the establishment was something else that he never abandoned as he moved to the right. Moving in that direction meant for Amos abandoning one set of ideas before it meant embracing another. He was repelled by the left rather than attracted by the alternative. What repelled him was the prevailing intellectual climate, which was overwhelmingly left-wing and at the same time he thought overwhelmingly bogus and dishonest, a shoddy parade of fashionable nostrums and attitudes. As the years went by, Amos was to become more at ease with his newly acquired right-wing attitudes, and being unusually ready to say what he thought in the bluntest of terms, acquired the reputation of an enraged Tory clubman. But it is probably the case that as he ceased to be left-wing, he found himself knowing better what he disliked in politics than what he liked. Europe was a case in point. He was an early and consistent opponent of British membership of the European Community. "Nothing less than full political union, of course, is in store for us," he wrote in his Observer piece, "as is revealed by even the least expert attempt to peer through the fog of official reticence. But union wouldn't work." He thought of each nation as a family, an organization based on something more than self-interest. But a super-family of nations, a European family, was an impossibility. As a writer, he saw no cultural dividend to be drawn from a united Europe. Language was to him all-important, and Britain's eyes and ears should, he felt, be turned to North America and other places where English was spoken, rather than to the continent. If Britain had to join something, Amos would have preferred it to have become America's 51st state. But he recognized the impossibility of that even as he wrote it down. America wouldn't have it, and there wasn't much enthusiasm in Britain either. That left only a revived patriotism to recommend as an alternative to Europe. Not perhaps much of a political platform, but the best he could think of. If there had been one pivotal point in Amos's political drift, it was Hungary in 1956. From then on, communist tyranny could not be denied, became indeed the principal enemy. Any illusion he may have kept that things would improve after the death of Stalin were gone for good, along with any lingering idea that Soviet-style rule could ever be benign. In a letter to Victor Galantz, written in December 1957, he described what he thought would happen if the Soviets ever did come to Britain. The Russians would take what loot they wanted, set up their bases, and leave the population to rot, and they would simply suppress the BBC and the press, not to mention shooting 500,000 chaps out of hand. The dreadful possibility of a Soviet takeover lingered in his mind for many years, and eventually formed the background of his 1980 novel, Russian Hide-and-Seek, which describes a Britain desolate and inert after 50 years of Soviet occupation. The Suez invasion was just as bad in its way as the occupation of Hungary, and Amos had been shocked and dismayed by it to the point of demonstrating in the streets of Swansea. But Suez was different from Hungary too. This shameful mistake, having been made by democracies, could at least be put right, and so it was when the French, British, and Israeli invasion forces withdrew from Egypt. The Soviet invaders, on the other hand, were totalitarians indifferent to public opinion, and therefore stayed put in Hungary. Yet this standing outrage seemed to be almost immediately forgotten by many on the left in Britain who chose to ignore it, even eradicate the whole event from their memory. the better to get on with the more agreeable business of finding fault with all things British and democratic. It was this capacity to put out of mind such bitter realities as did not fit a particular left-wing view of the world that stuck in Amos's craw, and gradually stoked his bile against all things left and their representative champion, the lefty. Still, he could not easily bring himself to give up voting Labour. Ever since he had first done so, in 1945, he saw himself as bound to keep on doing the same for the rest of his days. Habit was hard to break, and the thought of voting for any other party made him frankly uncomfortable, almost scared. Besides, he still had some faith in the party of Ernest Bevin, Clem Attlee, and Hugh Gaitskell. It could hardly, he thought, form worse governments than those of Eden and Macmillan, who had given Britain Suez. In 1964 he voted Labour once more, for the last time, as it was to turn out. At the next general election in 1966, he compromised and voted for the anti-common market candidate in his constituency. It was at the local elections the following year that he voted Conservative for the first time, and not until 1970 did he vote Tory in a national election. Jane may have played a part in all this. Not that she preached her moderate Toryism at Amos, but living with someone who saw nothing wrong in being right-wing may have made it easier for him to give up the political habits of his adult life. Other people certainly played a part in Amos's decision to switch. These were the people he saw in government after Labour's 1964 victory, among whom he took a particular dislike to Tony Benn. People like Benn, he thought, were very much not the same as the Labour stalwarts of 1945. Amos met Benn once, when he turned up unexpectedly on the Amos doorstep, bringing his American wife Carolyn and an American couple who were friends of hers and Amos's too. Amos offered them all a drink. Carolyn took a gin and tonic, but Tony, as Amos wrote in his memoirs, reacted much as if I had said, "Glass of baby's blood? It's extra good today," and would accept only a well-iced bitter lemon. It was characteristic of Amos that he should take an immediate dislike to Benn, not just for his balmy look or his unattractive politics, but for his hostility to alcohol in any form. Amos had already quarrelled with another prominent Labour politician, Tony Crossland, over gramophone records, and Amos had taken a further dislike to Crossland for his superior attitudes to America. Later, when Crossland became Labour's education secretary, Amos had more substantial bones to pick with him, and what he called the Crossland illiteracy commandos, who Amos believed were wrecking the new comprehensive schools even before they were properly established, by doing away with streaming and traditional sixth form preparation for university. Crossland was a ripe example of the Amosian lefty, not by any means necessarily unintelligent, simply wrong-headed, and therefore a fucking fool, no matter how clever. Although Crossland was an intellectual of considerable weight, he fitted into the lefty mould all the same, with such remarks he made when Education Secretary as, "If it's the last thing I do, I'm going to destroy every fucking grammar school in England," or, "Let us now move away from our snobbish, caste-ridden, hierarchical obsession with university status." Thus did the lefty arrogantly mow down whole swaths of tried and tested institutions in the name of some half-baked theory of progress. However bright, the lefty, as defined by Amos, was moved primarily not by ideas, but by feelings and emotions. He or she typically started out as a young person who had an unfocused dissatisfaction with the way things are, that is, with the way authority in the shape of employers or parents seemed to stand in the way of his or her freedom, just for the sake of being obstructive. In stage 2 of the lefty's development, the young man finds himself not getting on very far in a competitive world, and when he asks himself why, he finds a blissfully satisfying answer, which is that it's not his fault for being lazy or stupid or anything else. It's all the fault of the system that holds him back. So, from now on, the system must be opposed. And even when the lefty does manage to get on in the world, he continues to oppose the system out of habit, or because the system has quite failed to take notice of his protests and adjust itself accordingly. The lefty is someone who knows in his heart all about the evils of the Soviets, but cannot let that knowledge interfere with his own beliefs. And because the lefty hates the system, he must hate his country too. Affectionate portraits of England, from a socialist standpoint, are almost inconceivable, Amos wrote in a footnote in the James Bond dossier, and then tried his hand at a socialist essay in sentimental nostalgia. A world of soccer pitches and recreation grounds and trade union leaders, of Walsall, of the demonstrators being photographed with guitars across their knees in Trafalgar Square, of the pansies blooming outside Transport House. It just couldn't be done, he concluded. Amos knew all about his version of the lefty from having been one himself. He was old enough now to see his early communism as being much more about rebellion against his father than thought through conviction. But he had grown up and out of self-deception. This, too, was an emotional experience. Amos the righty was formed just as much by his feelings as Amos the lefty had been. Experience of the army, marriage, family, death, the first intimations of old age, had taught him a different set of feelings. Talking to the communist Morning Star soon after his novel The Anti-Death League was published in 1966, Amos described its theme as being that what causes the most unhappiness and feelings of revolt is the inescapable condition of human life. That is why I am no longer a left-wing socialist. He used to think, Amos went on, that human beings could be made significantly happier by transforming their outward lives. Now he thought differently. Their real enemies are not landlords, but cancer, not capitalism, but death, not warmongering, but the power to kill people. The next year he finally came out, not simply as not a left-wing socialist, but as no longer a socialist of any stripe. Now he was a Tory voter, and in a piece called Why Lucky Jim Turned Right, he explained his change of view. Experience had taught him that all-purpose blueprints for the brotherhood of man, or the just city, did not work because politics could not get rid of so many things that caused unhappiness and discontent. Failure, loneliness, fear, boredom, inability to communicate. And when politics did try to rescue people from these things, the result was inevitable disaster. Amos was not made happy by giving up all his utopian hopes, but he had come reluctantly to the conclusion that promoting the brotherhood of man led only to the enforcement of something very different. His own hopes had now dwindled to keeping things going. Plus, maybe an injustice righted here, an opportunity extended there. The logic of this led him unenthusiastically towards the Tories. He supported them precisely because he saw the Tories not as system builders or blueprint creators, but as the opposite, as the party of non-politics, of resistance to politics. A party without a romantic program, indeed with no program at all. I like that, he declared. Having given up the ready-made ideology of the left, Amos was not cut out to have an alternative ideology fit for the 1960s. Then and later, that required above all a view of how economic affairs should be conducted, and Amos had nothing whatever to say about that. I am no economist, he wrote in 1967, and went on to prove the point by saying that if he strained himself he could nearly imagine that the unchecked rise in the cost of living is part of some frightfully subtle plan to send it rocketing down again. This ignorance was not surprising in a man who left his own financial affairs to be conducted over the years by his father, his wives, and his accountants. All such matters bored him stiff in his own life, and in politics too. He stuck to issues he knew about, like education, or matters of broad principle, especially resistance to communism in all its multifarious forms and disguises. Once he had completed his shift to the right, Amos began to settle in, and relish his new position, in public and in private, showing a strength of conviction he had not shown for Labour for a very long time. His letters to Conquest, up to now mostly about gossipy or literary or practical matters, had a new earnestness injected into them, above all about communism, and in particular about communists in Vietnam. This became something of an obsession with Amos. Although American intervention there was widely opposed, in America and in Britain, and by people with all kinds of non-lefty views on other issues, Amos was all in favour. Attitudes to the American presence in Vietnam he took as a test of political soundness. If you wanted the Americans out, you were wrong and a fool, or a communist dupe, or both. And whatever your reasons, you were to be viewed with suspicion on other issues too. Vietnam was where communism was currently making its most aggressive thrust, so that was where it must be resisted. And if you couldn't see that, you couldn't be trusted on much. Even Martin felt the force of this argument, his father's insistence making him one of the exceptional young intellectuals of his time in not opposing American involvement in Vietnam. Writing to Conquest from Nashville in 1967, Amos described someone in the university's Russian department there as a very sound reactionary, and he chides Conquest for not being more aggressively polemical. I read in the TLS, Times Literary Supplement, about Lenin's statement and the balanced view which credits the Russian Revolution with its achievements. Aha. I think Bob or Tibor, Zamuli, a Hungarian refugee from the Soviet Gulag and a friend of Amos's, We'll get going on the balanced view, being that the RR was a disaster, and what achievements. And the following week, fuck all. Pull yourself together, you lazy sod. From Mexico the following February, Amos wrote again to Conquest. I nearly shat myself with fury on hearing that the Pissner, i.e. the listener, had put up that bastard Che Guevara as Man of the Year. And then just yesterday, Mac, Reynolds, a science fiction writer living in Mexico, told me that Tony Richardson was sending Alan Sillitoe to Mexico to write a film about Che G. Arrgh. Did you know this? Where will it all end? We must plan a monster counter-offensive when I get back. Here, by the way, you get a rather different kind of lefty who seems genuinely anti-commie, but can't or won't see that to be anti-US in Vietnam is to be pro-commie. Here, by the way, you get a rather different kind of lefty who seems genuinely anti-commie, but can't or won't see that to be anti-US in Vietnam is to be pro-commie. They all say there are no commies in USA, no commie component in draft card burnings, etc. Anyway, fuck 'em. Amos took up the same theme in another letter to Conquest in March, this time from Princeton. I'm sitting in front of the TV, though it's only 10:30 a.m., watching the Senate Foreign Relations Committee doing its stuff. At the moment that pompous old poop Fulbright is sounding off, saying it's jolly understandable that the North Viets are in Thailand, etc. Dean Rusk, U.S. Secretary of State, dealing with him very competently and unfussily. Not likely to go down well in Princeton. I met one chap who was sound on Vietnam. His wife has enormous tits, so he's clearly the sort of ally one wants. Otherwise it's all, I'm fiercely anti-communist, but, or even and, the US should get out by next Tuesday. Amos had first become right-wing about education, calling attention to falling university standards as early as Lucky Jim, and continuing to do so thereafter. In a 1960 piece he wrote of the pit of ignorance and incapacity into which British education had sunk since the war. University students were already illiterate enough to have difficulties with hard words like goes and its, though it was happily ignored by people playing what Amos had heard called the university numbers racket. So-called thinkers cited figures to prove that Britain was falling behind countries like Russia and America in its production of university graduates, so Britain would have to catch up. But the only way of increasing the number of graduates, Amos insisted, would be by lowering the level of qualifications for admission, and that would quite simply wreck academic standards beyond repair. More will mean worse, Amos resoundingly deduced from his own equation. The whole thrust of his piece was an attack on what he called the sociologizing generalization, or the kind of punditry that anathematized all things British on the slenderest of evidence. But that was exactly what he was now to find himself accused of doing. His more will mean worse was seized on, transformed, and turned against him in the press and the public mind. It assumed the shorthand form of more means worse, and became an iron Amosian rule applicable to all after-school teaching or training. All Amos had meant to say was that what he understood as traditional university standards of excellence could not be maintained if the doors were to be opened to a flood of new students. There just weren't enough good ones around with the necessary qualifications to fill the places. He was not talking about colleges of further education or technical training or anything else of that sort, only the traditional university as he had known it at Oxford, Swansea and Cambridge. Nevertheless, he was held to have condemned all forms of post-school education. This kind of thing was irritating, but harmless enough, so long as it got no further than being chatter in newspapers and magazines. But if it got a firmer grip on politics, and on life, then it was much more worrying to Amos. He feared that the sociologizing generalization would take over in a more sinister form, becoming a government principle for ordinary life. What I dislike, he wrote in 1962, is the thought of having my life organized by those who believe that there is a scientific answer for everything, or everything that counts. This wasn't true, but a society run on the belief that it was would, he thought, be hellish. There was no need to fear that life actually could be put under scientific control. What should be feared were those who thought it could be. Efficiency consultants, statisticians, social engineers, market researchers, administrative planners, cyberneticists, technological advisors. Here and there in the ranks of all these is the nucleus of a new priesthood. Amos may have started worrying about this by thinking about issues like education, and the way in which foolish policies were determined by quasi-scientific formulae, but he found himself going far beyond that, to imagine a whole world from which God, religion, and art had all been expelled, and replaced by a bogus scientism, directed by a corps of fake priestly experts. When Amos turned right, he found the Tories less infected by such superstitions than Labour, but far from innocent of them all the same. They continued to expand university education, for example, with as much fervour as their opponents. In this sense, at least, the Tories were only the lesser evil. Dystopian fears of a world gone wrong, far beyond any differences between two parties in a democracy, were to form the basis of two of Amos's novels, The Anti-Death League and Russian Hide-and-Seek. 17. Prague and Nashville. Travel in the 1960s helped confirm Amos in some of his political attitudes, as travel in the 1950s had illuminated some of his literary views and his feelings about the Britain abroad. He went with Jane to Prague in 1966 and found it fully as oppressive as he expected. The following year he went to teach for 4 months at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee, and found it surprisingly oppressive there too. Surprisingly, because after all it was America. In Prague, communism was the oppressor. In Nashville, racism. Tennessee may have been in the same United States as the Princeton where Amos had spent a year a decade earlier, but it was like being in a different world, one full of prejudice and hatred. Amos had been interviewed for a job teaching English literature in Prague in 1948, but had not been taken on. Only a few months earlier the communists had taken over in a coup, but the consequences had not yet become clear, and whatever they might be, they had not seemed more important to Amos at the time than getting work to support his wife and child. He was a very different political animal by the time he was invited to visit Prague for a week to deliver a lecture and talk to students. The invitation, delivered in person by a Czech embassy official called Peter Puschmann, was itself something of a surprise. Didn't they know that Amos was by this time a stout anti-communist? But it seemed that the angry young man reputation was the one which had stuck to his name in whatever files were kept on him in Prague, and when he proposed the literature of protest in Great Britain as the topic of his talk, Puschmann was enthusiastic. "Is good subject," he pronounced. Perhaps he would have felt differently if he had been there to hear the lecture which Amos used to pour brief doses of contempt on sundry left-wing British writers to illustrate his theme that there really wasn't much in Britain for writers to protest about. When Amos was finished, a member of the audience came up to tell him that the plays of Arnold Wesker could no longer be performed in Prague. What did he mean? Amos went on guard, smelling a political trap. But all the young man wanted to say was that Wesker was too political for the local taste, so nobody would turn up to hear his work, which was not unlike how Amos thought of Wesker's plays himself. Amos quite took to what he saw of the Czechs. They had, after all, been the only communists to pay him in money he could use for their translation of Lucky Jim, Stacny Jim. A decent 3-figure sum, too. And they employed a kind of straight-faced irony in their dealings with officialdom which Amos could sympathize with. He had some fun in Prague as well. Jazz was available, and he and Jane ran into Johnny Dankworth and Cleo Lane, jazz musicians and friends of theirs. Briefly, Amos could even feel twinges of regret that he had not got that job in 1948 after all. But only briefly. The overwhelming impression Prague made on Amos, as he described it in his memoirs, was of a stereotypical communist regime. The city was full of beautiful Baroque churches and other buildings worth looking at, but they were all jumbled up with industrial works and dreadfully polluted as a result. People smelled, but only, Amos surmised, because they preferred to spend their money on things like well-staged opera instead of lousy dry cleaning. The absence of colour in the streets was puzzling until he realized, on spotting a decrepit old martini ad, that the drabness was due to lack of advertising, which induced mild feelings of shame at how he had deplored the vile, garish, corrupting advertisements to be seen at home and in America. Everywhere there was corruption and surveillance, and the ordinary citizen survived only by engaging in the first of these and learning to slip and slide his way around the second. An attaché at the British Embassy told Amos that he could only talk freely to his wife on Sunday afternoon walks in the park. His guide and interpreter, Karel, took Amos to see his apartment as an example of the rewards to be expected by a lecturer at Prague University. It consisted of one room of modest size. Karel pointed impassively to each corner, saying, "This is the study, the living room, the bedroom, the bathroom, the kitchen." Here was another of the ways in which Prague, with a few saving graces, lived up to Amos's gloomy expectations, somehow turning out even more as he had imagined, by the more sinister characters being got up to look like clichés in their own roles, players selected by a Hollywood casting director, rather unimaginative in taste. It was with some relief that he left Czechoslovakia, even though the first place his train came to in the West was Nuremberg. Nashville aroused forebodings in Amos which were more than fulfilled. When he received his invitation to teach there, his first instinct was to refuse. The reputation of the American South for lynchings, and the kind of popular music and writing Truman Capote, William Faulkner, that Amos particularly disliked, was not encouraging. Then he had second thoughts. The invitation came from a reliable friend he had made on his earlier Princeton trip, Russell Fraser, a New Yorker who had become head of the English department at Vanderbilt University. Fraser assured Amos that things were not as bad in Nashville as was popularly supposed. Besides, the invitation was for only 4 months, and the teaching burden would not be excessive. Fraser added a point that carried particular weight with Amos. Britons were rarely spotted in the area. Amos had learned to keep clear of Britons in America, and of Britain-loving Americans, during his Princeton year. In Nashville he met a man called Tupper Saucy, whose wonderful name, which would have been better still if put the other way round, Saucy Tupper, Amos found no excuse at all for his being a flaming Anglophile shag. All such, he told Conquest, are very horrible. They talked about graciousness, the Queen, etc. Amos proposed a distinction between American lovers of Britain, Anglophiles, shits, and pro-British, possibly okay. Sticking to his rule of not flying anywhere ever, Amos arrived in New York with Jane on the Queen Mary liner in October 1967. He stayed at the Algonquin Hotel in the city for a few days, making contact with science fiction writing friends like Fred Pohl and Robert Sheckley, then spent a few more days in Princeton, staying with Edmund and Mary Keeley, friends he had made on his earlier visit, before embarking on a complicated zigzag train journey that went by way of St. Louis to Nashville. There they were picked up at the station by Fraser's wife Phil and driven into town. This turned out to be just as much of a cliché as Prague in its way. As Amos recalled it in his memoirs, Nashville was a very lifelike version of what you see every time you put the TV on and are shown a main street in a standard US town. No description was required to describe it, simply a list, including hamburger joint, gas station, and nobody on foot. Amos later turned the list into a verse of his poem, South. The usual, ranch-style, eat-a-mat drive-in, headlight, taillight, floodlight, neon, and air pollution. Nashville had some peculiarities of its own, besides the air pollution. The Grand Ole Opry, unvisited by Amos, a Parthenon, with a roof, an improvement on the one in Athens, and a roadside Holy Family, which changed colour from green to purple to yellow. But even these Amos regarded as more or less standard, and therefore unremarkable features of American life. Nashville, though, had a few extra uncongenial idiosyncrasies in store, including a ban on buying drinks other than beer in bars. You brought your own, and paid for glasses, ice, twists of lemon, and so forth, and a climate which, while giving the appearance in October of being more or less like England in June, made you pour with sweat after a modest walk at no great speed. Once, undertaking one of those, Amos found a police car keeping pace alongside him, just as they did in the movies. But the pervasive racism was the most uncongenial feature of all in the local landscape. Amos had hoped that whatever ordinary people might feel about blacks, at least those at the university, would be different. He was soon disillusioned. When he asked if there were any black students, he was told there was one, a Mr. Moore, who had seemed to enjoy Vanderbilt when he first arrived, but didn't much after 2 years there. Amos was invited to dinner by Walter Sullivan, the professor of English whose sabbatical had created the place Amos was in some not altogether clear sense taking. After a few drinks, the conversation veered round to what Amos had come to recognize as the staple subject. What was said he refrained from recording in his memoirs, on the ground that it was too strong meat, if not actually against British race laws. But he quoted verbatim one sentence uttered by his host. "I can't find it in my heart to give a Negro, pronounced nigger, or a Jew an A, i.e. A grade." For a moment Amos thought Sullivan had switched to satirical mode and was taking off the local bigots. After all, Sullivan was a university teacher, a writer of novels. Surely he couldn't mean it. The chorus of support from the other dinner guests soon put Amos straight. Sullivan, he learned, was one of those who had given a party when President Kennedy was shot. There were other dismaying encounters. A man in labor relations told Amos that scientific tests had proved the black man's brain was smaller than the white man's, and yet he'd heard the British were letting them come to their country from all over the place. Had they gone mad? Amos's hostess at a party, wife of the professor of Iberian languages, could not understand why Laurence Olivier had acted Othello as a black man, and when Amos counter-argued, not very sincerely, that Olivier had done it rather well in that way, protested, "But how could a real lady fall in love with a man like that?" Then there was the student called Julie Smith. She was one of the most beautiful girls Amos had ever seen, and if Jane had not been there, well, he might have, done what he often did, or anyway try. Not only was Julie beautiful, but bright, in fact the model student, and yet after a party Jane reported a conversation she had had with her in which Julie had revealed herself to be just like all the others under her attractive surface. Jane told her that there were reports of race troubles all over America, but there seemed to be none around Nashville, and Julie replied that that was because the northern states didn't know how to keep 'em down. Keep 'em down. Perhaps you could expect the 50-ish Walter Sullivan to be unreconstructed, but you might have hoped the 20-ish Julie would be different. Maybe, Amos speculated in his memoirs, her children now are. Racism was the one issue that made Amos wobble on his right-wing plinth, and see some surviving good reasons for leftiness. The nigger gets talked about in terms that recall the most tedious lefty play, he wrote to Conquest, soon after he had settled in. Buggers haven't learned a bloody thing. One can forgive a lefty here, in that conservative opinion is so shitty. It would take some strength of mind not to say, in effect, anybody who thinks that about Negroes must be wrong about everything. Stop U.S. murder in Vietnam. Amos thought of various strategies for dealing with this racism when he came across it. Argue, laugh, fight, walk out, resign. What he actually did was kept my mouth shut, avoided assenting to what could not be assented to, and made the most of the good bits, human and other. Nor, in spite of his genuine hatred of this southern racism, did he let it spoil his affection for America. Even though he was later to think of his spell in Nashville as the period other than his army service he would least wish to relive, he still very much liked the country. Amos found himself one night at a dinner where a Labour MP, Ivor, now Lord Richards, made a speech saying that Britain was turning towards Europe, and the old special relationship with America was on the way out. Called on to add his bit, Amos said Richards had talked balls, and Britain was as attached to America as ever. No local displays of racism, however foul, could override Amos's feelings for America as a whole. The America of jazz, films, and science fiction, of freedom, efficiency, and generous hospitality. As the weather grew colder, Amos and Jane settled into a new routine. Both of us working like bloody fools, Amos told Conquest at the beginning of November. Jay running the house, most unbelievably shagged and inconvenient south of the Mason-Dixon line, as well as novelizing. Good old Kay doing 3 fucking lectures a week, and also doing his best to novelize. Amos had the Daily Telegraph sent on, making him feel like a Morm rubber planter when he went to pick it out of the mailbox. But he felt starved of gossip from home and asked Conquest for news. The routine included, as always, a great deal of drinking, perhaps even more than usual. When he came to write his memoirs, Amos felt able to state with complete confidence that he had a hangover the day after one incident, because he had a hangover practically every day he was in Nashville. This was due partly to the local hospitality. Some 50 social events were staged for or around the Amoses, partly to the general strain of life in Nashville. On evenings in, Amos would sit drinking large dry martinis in melancholy mood, chilly now because the central heating was inefficient and the logs in the fireplace damp, wondering if the ferocious dog from next door, Major, would finally get to him on his next trip to the mailbox. Occasionally conscious of the dreadful portrait of the woman who had rented him the house, Ivor Lou Duncan, who was rapacious enough to have tried to make him pay rent on her husband's typewriter, though her husband vetoed the notion. For Amos, the best part of his time in Nashville was in his dealings with students, something he always enjoyed. There had been no such dealings since he left Cambridge, and there were to be none again after he left Nashville. A matter for lasting regret. Jane drove him to the university for his thrice-weekly lectures, and he was met at the gates by a graduate called Don Schultz, assigned to him as a general guide and helper, who escorted him to the lecture theatre, where he confronted a class of 100 or more. These sessions, lecture plus questions, lasted an hour or so, and Amos came to think of the class as about the best I ever taught, punctual, polite, attentive, ready but not over-ready with questions and objections, containing that ingredient essential for a decent course of lectures, however much the lecturer may squirm at its presence, a couple of students of whom he is very slightly afraid. Amos included in his course writers like Len Dayton, Ian Fleming, and John le Carré, as well as more literary writers like Iris Murdoch, William Golding, and Graham Greene. No doubt this was one reason for his popularity, but another was his lecturer's talent. A reporter described his style. He manages, as the best all do, to achieve balance between entertainment and pedagogy. His open, shoot-from-the-hip approach is different from that of other teachers at Vanderbilt. One of his students accurately observed that the chief difference was that Mr. Amos's is a writer's approach to fiction. Another, who seemed a bit overwhelmed, described him as anti-academic, anti-literary, almost anti-intellectual. But they loved him. By and large, the Amoses went down well too on the social circuit. The same reporter recorded the opinion of a woman who had seen a lot of them at parties. They were really an ideal couple. Amos was virile, jolly, and a man who loves to entertain, while Jane was tall, mod, really good-looking, and very intense. Amos's snuff-taking took them by surprise. He found it impossible to get what he wanted in Nashville, where oral snuff was all that was available, and had to badger Conquest to send supplies of high dry toast from Freiburg and Traer in the Haymarket. "It's the thumb in the nose that stops them every time," the reporter wrote. Amos got into odd rows, as with a French-Canadian on the question of separatism, and a woman who took it for granted he was an atheist. "Where do you get your ideas?" she asked him. "Why, from God, of course. Where else would you suppose they come from?" Amos also shocked a large part of university opinion by his belligerence over Vietnam. American involvement was becoming a hot issue on campuses all over America, and Amos's enthusiasm for the cause, he even proposed that Britain should send a token force, was not at all welcome at Vanderbilt. His reputation as a right-winger had preceded Amos to Nashville, and according to one version of what happened there, his hosts had played up to it, becoming stage Southerners for his benefit, especially hamming it up on the race issue. A friend Amos made at Vanderbilt, Richard Porter, a lecturer in German, later wrote that racial talk in most academic circles in Nashville differed little from that in the North. He claimed to have heard several people wishing to please make racial slurs around the Amoses they would not have made otherwise. Porter speculated that Amos might have been influenced by his sponsor Russell Fraser, who ran into trouble with the university authorities over his teaching program while Amos was in Nashville. The authorities wanted a greater emphasis on Southern writers than did Fraser, and came close to quitting. Amos described this to Conquest as a first-class Groves of Academe-type dust-up, and felt while it lasted that if Fraser went, he would have to go too. On this version, Amos became disillusioned with Nashville by the treatment dished out to Fraser, and, with his sympathies twisted, went on to misread local attitudes because they were greatly exaggerated for him, so that the South should be made to appear full of exactly the kind of people he was thought to expect, indeed want, to find there. Was Amos misled by a charade staged just for him? It seems most unlikely, since it is difficult to believe that such a large cast of characters as he encountered in Nashville could have been so uniformly well drilled in simultaneous dissimulation, or that Amos, with his own gift for mimicry, would not have seen through any such attempt at mass deception. At any rate, he left Nashville certain that his own reading of its deep and pervasive racism was the correct one. Writing to Conquest a month or so afterwards, he said that in retrospect his spell in Tennessee seemed rather like the days of the captivity in the eyes of the children of Israel. Later he summed up his bleak view of the place in his poem South, in which he has an imaginary, or not so imaginary, Southerner say, "You blind? Can't you see they're inferior? Our women's what they're really after. You gotta use fear." There was hope to north and west. In Mexico and even Africa, the poem went on, but it finished, In the South, nothing now or ever. For black and white, no future. None. Not here. From Nashville in mid-January 1968, the Amises went by train via St. Louis again to Mexico, where they met up with Edmund and Mary Keeley. The four toured for a bit. Seeing things like the pyramids at Teotihuacan was it, Amis wrote to Conquest, which impressed greatly. And Maximilian's palace at Cuernavaca, which was a fucking pain. Also Acapulco, where I had a suitcase stolen, nothing vital. And Mexico City, where we had a 40-second earthquake tremor. Amis thought he was having a heart attack until Edmund Keeley put him straight on what was happening. At Acapulco, Amis took his first and only dip in the Pacific, but the plumbing was dreadful, and the whole place struck him as fairly horrible. It suggested to him a possible opening for a James Bond story. Bond had never liked Acapulco. Then at the beginning of February, they went on to San Miguel de Allende. A bloody good spot. The first place we've really felt at home in since Princeton, back at the beginning of September. 6,000 feet plus altitude, about 200 miles northwest of Mexico City. Weather like a hot English June. Amis was stripped to the waist as he wrote his letter, on the terrace of the Hotel Posada de las Monjas, and drinking a kind of tequila Bloody Mary with a hell of a lot of Tabasco and so on in the bloody part. Very sustaining. He and Jane had gone to San Miguel for 4 weeks to write, aiming to finish the novels they had been working on in Nashville. He, I Want It Now, she, Something in Disguise. San Miguel was full of American tourists and artists, a class of person Amis might be expected not to want around him much, but they justified themselves in his eye because their presence made things like shops, bars, and doctors look up, and could be a source of evening conversation too. They were under the very solid wing of Amis's new friend Mac Reynolds, an American science fiction writer who lived in the town. To add to Amis's sense of well-being, 2 consignments of snuff turned up from Conquest within 2 days of each other, on top of which Amis avoided getting the shits for his entire 6.5 weeks in Mexico, though a day after he crossed the border back into the United States, he found himself herring to the John. At the beginning of March, the Amises started trickling northwards again by train to stay with the Keeleys in Princeton for a few days before boarding the Queen Elizabeth for home. They had a wonderful journey, although the immigration authorities held them up at the U.S. border, making them nearly miss their St. Louis connection. Amis was now eager to be back in London. He was looking forward to lunching with Conquest and other friends the day after he reached Southampton on the 20th of March, and was a little dashed when Conquest told him the date of the lunch had been moved forward, so he would miss it. But Conquest redeemed himself by arranging a party soon afterwards. 18. Barnet. I heard just an hour ago that Hilly is getting married today, Amis noted laconically in a letter to Robert Conquest from Nashville on the 21st of November 1967. Any news on this, welcome? Since Amis had by then been married to Jane for a couple of years, Hilly's marriage to her Cambridge don Shackleton Bailey looked like putting a firm and final end to their relationship, matters to do with the children apart. Any idea that they might one day get together again in any new setup would have seemed outlandish, unimaginable. Amis would not have wanted it. He was happy as he was with Jane. His feelings about her were not the kind of thing he would mention in his letters. Amis has been as discreet about the details of his own private life, even with friends, as he has been reticent about sex in his fiction. He could breezily recommend Mexico to Conquest for its charms, in terms with which they were both at ease. Tequila is murder, but local gin is good, and about 15 shillings a bottle. Even Scotch, hardly more than at home. Food excellent, wine awful piss, like tar water, but beer drinkable. But the charms of his life with Jane were not to be bandied about in any terms. If not to be discussed in letters, Amis's feelings towards Jane do find their way heavily camouflaged into his fiction, as whatever is preoccupying him at the time he writes has a habit of doing. It is possible to make out the arc of his feelings about women in general, and Jane in particular, first soaring upwards, then dismally sinking, through the long sequence of Amis's novels. These do not spell out exactly the story of his emotional life, but they do reflect it intermittently, and sometimes closely. The first 2 mainstream novels of Amis's years with Jane, The Anti-Death League and I Want It Now, are very different in tone and content from each other. The first is somber and serious, ruminating on themes of life and death within the framework of a spy story. The second is social comedy about the adventures of an ambitious journalist and his rich, unhappy girlfriend. But in spite of their obvious differences, the two novels have themes in common, themes which reveal a good deal about Amos and Jane. In The Anti-Death League, published in 1966, Captain James Churchill falls in love with Catherine Casement, whose name Jane suggested to Amos. Catherine has had two husbands, as Jane had before she met Amos, marrying for the first time young at 19, as Jane did too. When Churchill asks why her first husband married her, she replies that it just must have been that he wanted to be married. All his friends were, so he should be too. That marriage becomes monochrome, purposeless. Then Casement turns up and offers to extricate her from it. He is marvellous at first, but the moment we got married he started being different. As for sex, with her first husband she didn't get a great deal out of it, at any rate early on, and as for the second husband, after they were married he took to hitting her. But now with Churchill it is love, strong and sure to last, virtually at first sight. "I could never love anyone else in the way I love you," he says. And she replies, "I haven't done any loving before worth talking about." This is not, of course, an exact account of Jane's first two marriages, or her third, but there are resemblances. Her marrying young, for instance, and the style of her treatment by her first two husbands. Then, after two failures, has come what appears to be a resounding success in love. It was as if Jane, like Catherine, has at last been fully aroused in the embrace of her lover. In The Anti-Death League, this theme of arousal is only one of several. In I Want It Now, published in 1968, it became more central and more explicit. The story and characters of I Want It Now are, if anything, even less close to Amos and Jane than those of The Anti-Death League. With all Amos's novels, the central situation is what comes into his mind first. Lucky Jim, for instance, sprang from the half-hour Amos spent in the Leicester University Senior Common Room when Philip Larkin left him there in 1946. The central situation of I Want It Now arose from a chance remark of Jane's when she wondered aloud what it might be like to be a daughter of her childless friend Dolly Burns, the rich socialite daughter of the art dealer Lord Duveen. In response to this intriguing question, Amos created Simone, the beautiful but sexually and otherwise bewildered daughter of the rich and domineering Lady Baldock. Amos also invented Ronnie Appleyard, a television presenter and journalist on the make, to be Simone's lover. When the book was published, people asked Amos if Appleyard was really Robin Day or David Frost, or some other real-life television star of the day. But Appleyard was nobody. He was pure invention, made a television personality mainly because Amos thought such people could be expected to possess the outsized egotism his character required. If anybody in the book resembled anybody in life, it was Lady Baldock. At least Bobby Burns, Dolly's husband, saw a likeness in her to his wife, and told Amos he would not be giving the novel to Dolly to read. Amos and Jane are not in the least like Ronnie and Simone. All the same, the fictitious story of the latter contains a version of the true romance of the former. Ronnie Appleyard starts out as wholly dislikable. He beats the anti-apartheid and ban the bomb drums, but only because they are intellectually in fashion, and therefore expedient views for him to hold. His real interests are not in any kind of politics, but in money, sex, and fame. And at 36, his only interest in marriage is to promote his acquisition of all of these, particularly the first. When he meets Simone at a party, he is instantly attracted by her beauty, but her attraction is indefinitely multiplied when he discovers that she is the daughter of the wealthy Lady Baldock. Simone is in a mess, largely because of her mother. She first tried sex at 14 and hated it, but keeps energetically trying. She is the one who wants it now from Ronnie within minutes of meeting him at a party, in the hope of its getting better and of finding a man who will love her. As Ronnie pursues her to Greece and America, his feelings change. He falls genuinely in love. So does she. For her, sex with Ronnie becomes very nearly enjoyable, while he becomes willing, indeed determined, to marry her for herself, even without her money. This story, stripped of its social and comic trappings, is a retelling of the Sleeping Beauty myth. Prince Ronnie awakens Princess Simone. Appleyard is aware that that is the part he is playing. Over scotch and water in the Duke of Marlborough, he thought he saw that he had indeed awakened the Sleeping Beauty. To the cynical Appleyard, this is a mixed blessing. Now here he was, not only stuck with her, but far more alarming, wanting to be stuck with her, wishing he was stuck with her in a real sense, instead of just being unable to stop thinking about her. Falling in love diverts, even subverts, selfishness and ambition. Later, when he has been well and truly stuck with Simone, but without her money, he tells her, "Very odd, this whole thing. I was a shit when I met you. I still am in lots of ways. But because of you, I've had to give up being a dedicated, full-time shit." If he has been a shit, Simone admits that she has been a terrible fool. "Perhaps we'll have to work on each other," Appleyard says. "Helping each other not to be as bad as we would be on our own," she replies. Exactly so. Not only has Prince Ronnie awoken Princess Simone, her love has redeemed him, made him less self-absorbed, more like a proper prince of romance. A better man, at least. In something like the same way, Prince Kingsley has awakened Princess Jane, and perhaps they too are living better lives together than they could hope to do separately. This sense of helping one another to do better, of the couple adding up to more than the sum of two singles, comes across in an interview Amos and Jane gave in tandem to the Daily Mail soon after they came home from their honeymoon in Brighton in October 1965. Kingsley: "I remember you were very timid when I met you. She was, you know, shy and uncertain of herself." Jane: "I agree." Kingsley: "She was full of doubts. Whenever she proposed doing anything or cooking something, she'd ask 2,000 times, 'Is that all right?' Now she's sure. I've given her that. Women get sureness and confidence from being happy." Jane: "You're more relaxed, too." Kingsley: "Yes, that's true. Is it that I'm older?" "No. I think Jane has changed me, too." Jane: "I admit it. I'm really dotty about Kingsley." This might be Ronnie and Simone speaking. Within the comedy and the cynicism of I Want It Now, the novel's core is pure, uncynical romance. So, in those early years, did Amos and Jane's relationship seem to be. In this novel, Amos's romantic trajectory reached its highest point, as it did in his life while he was writing it. Here and in his earlier novels, Amos's heroes had always liked women, even when they only had sex on their minds. That was at least evidence that they liked women after their fashion. There were women, too, who thoroughly deserved to be liked, admired, loved, and often to be treated better than they were. Jean Lewis in That Uncertain Feeling, or Jenny Bunn in Take a Girl Like You. After I Want It Now, romance went into decline. Women might still be desirable, but they were no longer so often or so clearly admirable or nice. There had always been unpleasant women in the novels, from Margaret Peele in Lucky Jim to Lady Baldock. Now that unpleasant side of them began to take over, while some Amosian heroes could be seen less as men who loved women, more as misogynists. This decline in romance was not vertical or precipitate, but gradual, matching, in fact, the spread of Amos's own disillusion about women as his relationship with Jane slowly and painfully disintegrated. Soon after they returned to England from Nashville, Amos and Jane decided they must have a larger house. While they were in America, Sargy Mann had moved in at 108 Maida Vale to help keep Monkey company, and all now agreed they wanted him to stay on, putting further pressure on limited space. Jane was attracted to the idea of living in the countryside, and Amos was too. Not that he had any great fondness for birds or flowers or landscape. Jane once listed for Vogue his likes and dislikes, and when she came to the country, she described it as something that was out for him, except to go to the pub in, or to have lunch somewhere out there, indoors. What attracted him to country living was not the scenery, but what he had heard years before about village life in Wales, where people were said to pop in and out of each other's houses and behave as neighbours are supposed to do. But Amos liked to be within reach of London, too. A compromise was the answer, and one was found. Someone spotted an advertisement in Country Life for a house called Gladsmuir, on Hadley Common in Barnet, and the whole household went out to take a look. In front of the house was Hertfordshire, behind it London. The prospect was rural, while the location was umbilically linked to the city by the London Tube System's Northern Line, which terminated a longish walk or short drive from Gladsmuir. Here was a country house with plenty of space that could be called a townhouse too. Philip, Martin, and Monkey all liked what they saw and thought they should move there. So did Amos and Jane. The remainder of the lease on 108 Maida Vale was sold for £10,000, and the house bought for £47,000. Jane discovered that it had once been called Lemons, decided that that had a better ring to it than Gladsmuir, and restored the old name. When the decision to move was made, she gave everyone a talking to. Lemon's was not simply bigger than Maida Vale, it was very big indeed. The ground floor was sufficiently ample to provide them with a large hall, a study for Amos, a spacious drawing room opening onto the garden, a library, which was a little smaller, a bedroom and bathroom en suite, a couple of tack rooms, and down a few steps a decent-sized kitchen. On the floor above, there were 5 rooms, one of which became Jane's study, as well as bathrooms, and there were more rooms on the floor above that, too. On top of all this, there was a 9-acre garden to cope with. They did not have money for a large staff, so if they were going to live there, Jane told them they must all pull their weight. They all agreed that they would, but none lived up to their promise, though in the summer of 1968, as reports of Soviet tanks rolling into Czechoslovakia could be heard on the radio, Monkey, Sargy Man, and Martin did rewire the house between them. Martin was rewarded with a bedroom on the first floor for his trouble, a cause of some later resentment on Philip's part. Lemon's appears recognisably itself as the home of Sir Roy Van der Vane in Amos's 1971 novel Girl 20. Opening the gates to his house, you walked into a paved courtyard, adorned with small trees in a sickly or dead condition. Entering the house, you went through a glass porch of recent addition, where there were a lot of very old coats on an old coat stand, and a lot of empty whiskey and wine bottles. A further door gave onto a passage, and a near and distant staircase. The passage led to a drawing room, with a large bow window at the farther end. Through this window could be seen a view of descending lawns, a sunlit wall with trees fastened to it, and some much bigger trees, cedars of different types, farther down. Much farther still were the roofs of the town, looking rather serious over the distant treetops. Around the feet of a visitor to the Van der Vanes skittered a red Cavalier Spaniel bitch called Furry Barrel, a reactionary little dog, authoritarian, hierarchical, snobbish. In fact, it was very like Jane's dog, Rosie. Some help around the house was affordable. Mr. Mayhew worked in the garden, Mrs. Lucy helped with the vegetables, and eventually Mrs. Uniacke moved in, first to help look after Jane's ailing mother, Catherine, later as housekeeper, occupying the cottage alongside the house proper. But that still left Jane with a lot of chores to handle. She took charge of the practical side of everything: money, decorators, staff, the kitchen, the garden. Since Amos, Monkey, and Man worked at home, all 3 were present for lunch as well as dinner. The boys were often there too, and Jane was expected to provide 2 meals a day for all of them. Lemon's in Barnet was a long distance from Amos's first home at Buckingham Gardens in Norbury, not only in geographical strides across London, but in relative splendour. In fewer than 30 years, all the way from a little 4-room box of a place to a house of nearly 30 rooms. This may have been a gratifying measure of professional success, but the material or glamorous side of it was of no great importance to Amos. So long as he had drink, television, books, a room of his own in which to work, and adequate access to chaps and conviviality, he was genuinely content to live without frills. When they had been together for 14 years, and Jane knew her husband thoroughly, she wrote in her Vogue article that he had less interest in money or his surroundings, or indeed in acquisitions of any kind, than anyone I have ever met. This had its advantages for her, but it had its irritating side too. His total lack of interest in houses, for instance, has cut both ways. He finds out what he does not like too late for comfort. What Amos was ultimately to find most dislikable about Lemon's was its location. It was too far from clubs, restaurants, and chaps, especially for someone like him, for whom travel by tube was a real trial of nerves, and the compensating neighbourliness Amos had hoped to find in Barnet did not materialise. There were suitable people round about to cultivate: Robert Carr, later Home Secretary, Norman Delmar, the conductor, Ralph Harris of the Institute of Economic Affairs. In Amos's view, the cultivation of neighbours was down to the woman of the house. She should go next door for coffee, return the invitation in due course, and generally get things off the ground. But Jane did not do enough of this, according to him. At any rate, not much Welsh-style popping in and out of houses took place. In her Vogue article, Jane noted another rare attribute in her husband. He never pretends to like anything. Book, music, or film, he would not say he liked any single example of them merely to be fashionable, or because not approving might reveal ignorance on his part. This too had its disadvantages, because it also meant that there were whole areas of taste in which he took no interest at all, not even simulated. Besides the country, other things that were out for him included most architecture, the theatre, Shakespeare excepted, drama on television or in films, foreign travel and games, indoor as well as outdoor. Some of these dislikes, such as the theatre, were long-standing, others had built up over the years. Amos, for instance, continued to go on holidays with Jane through the 60s and 70s, to Greece, Turkey, France, even as far as Jamaica, where they were the guests of Dolly Burns, though with increasing reluctance. Other irksome habits were there from the start, too. Resistance to order, for instance. Books and papers accumulated in his study until there was nowhere to sit or even stand. He left his clothes where he took them off, for the simple reason that he didn't like putting them away. He was extremely good at not being handy around the house, Jane wrote, and his incapacity extended to business matters like buying and selling property, all such transactions being left to her. Not being much interested in possessions himself, he was bad at buying presents for other people, but at the same time prone to grouse if his own presents were not up to scratch. Bit dull, isn't it? Being given pyjamas. Amos was fussy about his food, too. The only thing that he was certain to like were curries and onions,